So, as you all know, last week, CNN hosted a debate between Bernie Sanders and Ted Cruz about tax reform, and I was not necessarily intending on covering that because it aired after I finished recording the last episode of the show, and I didn't have time to cover it over the weekend, so I just thought, you know what, I'll catch the next debate. But I ended up watching it on Sunday. I caught it late, and I couldn't not talk about it because I think that this was the best performance from Bernie Sanders yet. I think that this debate was probably even more embarrassing for Ted Cruz than his infamous porn tweet debacle, because, Bernie Sanders articulated exactly why Ted Cruz was towing the Republican Party line when it comes to tax policy. And this was because he was paid to do that. He is a shill that was literally corrupted by big money donors. Ted Cruz likes to pretend to be an anti-establishment Republican, but we all know that's not the case. He is corrupt, just like the political establishment, particularly his own party, and he's bought off by the Koch brothers and really all of the most egregious figures in politics. So Bernie Sanders explained that Ted Cruz came to the policy positions that he's at now because he was bought off. And Bernie Sanders brought up money in politics on multiple occasions, and I thought that it was just great because it exposed the fraud that Ted Cruz really is.
Why do you think the Koch brothers and Ted Cruz's major donors, billionaires, are supporting these proposals? Do you think they're staying up nights worrying about working families? Do you think they're worried about kids who can't afford to go to college? Do you think they're worried about elderly people who can't keep their homes warm in the wintertime? They are not. You got one group of people, the Koch brothers, two people, worth over $95 billion. They are going to spend $300 million alone in this campaign cycle to do what? To pass legislation that protects the interest of the wealthy and the powerful, and to support candidates like Senator Cruz who will do just that.
It is nonsensical. I have sat with farmer after farmer after farmer that has a lot of land. So under Bernie's definition, they're rich. They've got a lot of land. And they go broke every year planning and paying people's salaries and barely making ends meet. And yet the death tax would make them sell their farm. That's
Ted,
not fair and it's not right.
That's a good speech.
Thank
but
you.
It has nothing to do with reality.
I appreciate that.
Here's the reality. You know, after Trump and people like Senator Cruz go around saying, oh, it's mostly the workers and the farmers and the ranchers who are going to pay the estate tax, Steve Mnuchin, who is our Secretary of Treasury, this is what he said, and I quote, obviously, the estate tax, I will concede, disproportionately helps rich people. Yeah, it helps rich people, the top 0.2%. 99.8% of families of somebody who died do not pay a nickel in the estate tax. Factcheck.org said, quote, less than 1% of farm operators, less than 1% of farm operator estates is projected to pay any estate tax. Tax Policy Center said, quote, only an estimated 80 small farmers will pay any estate tax in 2017. Center on Budget and Policy Priorities said only the wealthiest 0.2% will pay estate tax. Here's who the beneficiaries are. And this is why the Koch brothers are spending so much money to see this legislation passed. Their family will benefit to the tune of some $30 billion. So spending a few $100 million to elect people like Senator Cruz is pocket change if a family is going to get $30 billion.
So what I really liked about Bernie Sanders' performance is that prior to the debate, he anticipated what bullshit arguments Ted Cruz would be using, and he was able to prepare by bringing specific facts to debunk anything Ted Cruz was saying. So he talked about the estate tax and how that disproportionately harms farmers, according to Ted Cruz, but Bernie Sanders actually came with the facts and said, no, this isn't actually the case. When it comes to the estate tax, it's a brazen giveaway to the rich. That's all that the estate tax does. It just benefits really rich families like the Trumps and the Waltons, and Bernie Sanders made that case. So everything that Ted Cruz tried to say, there was no getting past Bernie Sanders. He had an answer for everything, and there was no moment during this debate where I thought, man, even though I disagree with Ted Cruz, I think that he is debating in a more effective way. I never thought that once during this whole debate. Bernie Sanders did a phenomenal job at explaining exactly why donors like to buy off Republican politicians, but also Democratic politicians too. But I mean, he used the example of the Koch brothers and tax policy. The reason why they spend millions on campaigns is because the return on investment is absolutely huge. But what Ted Cruz then tried to do, since he wasn't able to really win this debate based on the merit of his arguments, he tried to just jab Bernie Sanders here and there. So he threw in socialists to smear Bernie Sanders, and Bernie Sanders was not having it.
One of the things I like about debating Bernie is he's honest. When he ran in Vermont, he ran as a socialist, an unabashed socialist.
No, I ran as an independent, longest-serving independent in the history of the United States Congress.
Are you a socialist or not?
I am a democratic socialist, similar to the folks. Okay. But don't tell me I didn't run as a socialist. I ran as an independent. You told
people you were a socialist. Fine.
You didn't run as a right-winger. You ran as a Republican, right?
I am happily a conservative.
Conservative, all right.
I am happily a conservative.
Now, you've really got to pay close attention to the look on Ted Cruz's face, because you can tell that Bernie Sanders was embarrassing him, because how could you not with the stupid arguments he was making? I mean, what Ted Cruz was saying, it was idiotic, and you don't even really have to look up things he was saying in order to debunk it. I mean, his arguments were just, you could dismiss them at face value. Now, one in particular was an argument he made about Cuba.
As a Cuban American, I have a different way of looking at it, something liberals never seem to notice. If you go down to Key West, the rafts from Cuba are all coming one direction. We don't see any Hollywood liberals jumping on rafts and heading to Cuba for free health care, because it doesn't work in practice. It's a disaster in practice.
These liberals are so dumb because they never seem to realize that all the rafts coming from Cuba, they're always flowing in one direction. Really, Ted? That's your argument? That statement almost made Bernie Sanders' head explode. Guess what? I'm going to blow your mind, Ted. It's closer. If you are from Cuba and you're trying to flee an oppressive regime, why would you choose to risk your life even more and try to go to Europe or try to go to Canada? I mean, you're going to come to the United States because it's closer. And he also said here, we don't see any Hollywood liberals jumping on rafts and heading to Cuba for healthcare, and that's because it doesn't work in practice. Well, first of all, there's been an embargo on Cuba since most of us were born, so we weren't allowed to go there even if we wanted to. And second of all, there was at least one Hollywood liberal that did jump on a raft and go to Cuba, Michael Moore.
It's so hard for me to digest somebody saying it's free, because 20 years of our lives have been spent fighting. So I am so grateful.
I don't know. You don't need to say that. Okay?
Thank you. Thank
okay.
you.
Now, the reason why those Americans were so emotional was because they couldn't comprehend the level of care that they were receiving from a country that our leaders have demonized for decades. That was the perceived enemy. But they were getting free healthcare that was actually quality healthcare. Now, just because you may disagree with Cuba politically and look down upon their political situation, that doesn't mean that we can't learn from them, at least when it comes to healthcare, because even if we disagree with their regime, well, we can still learn when it comes to healthcare, because just because one aspect of a country is bad doesn't mean that every single aspect about it is bad. And just objectively speaking, there's a lot that we can learn from Cuba. But the problem with this country is that we are either incapable of learning from other countries, or we just don't want to learn. We bury our heads in the sand. And speaking of other countries, there was someone in the audience from Denmark that was a Republican. Seemingly, he was conservative, and he was brought on to make Bernie Sanders look bad, since Bernie Sanders always talks about Scandinavia. But unbeknownst to this individual who was there, presumably to make Ted Cruz look better, he ended up helping Bernie Sanders' argument. And after he sat down, Bernie Sanders brought him back to ask him a question about healthcare. And it was genius what Bernie Sanders was able to do.
I was born and grew up in Denmark, And these are countries where the government spends taxes and spends approximately twice the level of the United States. Mm-hmm. And while I am very sympathetic to many of your spending proposals, especially on the things you mentioned on early childhood and single payer and the like, I also know that these are countries that heavily tax everybody, not just the rich people, middle classes. They have consumption taxes on everything of 20%. So while I'm very sympathetic to what you say, my sense is still that you would like to spend as a Scandinavian, but not tax as one. Is that correct?
We have, the answer is, and you raised some very good points. When we talk about healthcare, for example, okay, what my proposal would do, as I'm sure you understand, how much do you pay, or the people in Denmark pay for healthcare when they go to the doctor?
There is an approximately, if I'm not, it's about $10 copay for everybody.
$10. And how much do you pay when you go to the hospital? If you have cancer, God forbid, and you went to the hospital, how much would it cost you?
Zero.
Oh, it costs you zero. And how much is preschool, high-quality preschool for the children in Denmark?
It would depend a little bit on the region of the country, but I'd say in $200 or $300 a month.
$200 or $300 a month, okay? And what about college in Denmark? Our kids can't afford to go to college. How much does it cost to go to college in Denmark?
Well, in fact, you get a government stipend to go to college.
In other words, not only is it free, they give you a stipend because they want to make sure, correct me if I'm wrong, that they take advantage of the wisdom of all of the kids. They want to make sure that every kid in that country gets the best education he or she can have. Is that correct?
If you have the appropriate grade average.
Right, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So here is the point. And your point is well taken. To provide quality, virtually free childcare, to provide free higher education, to provide virtually free healthcare, it costs money. Nothing is free. Taxes are high. You're right. But I would suggest that the average American would rather pay $3,000 more in taxes and see a $5,000 premium to a private insurance company disappear. They will be better off. In Denmark, my guess is, please correct me if I'm wrong, probably the per capita cost in healthcare is half what it is in the United States. Is that a good guess?
Approximately, yes.
Okay. So the point is, they are able to run a high-quality healthcare system, probably better than ours, at half of the cost because it's a public healthcare system. But to answer to your point, and it's a fair point, nothing is for free. But I believe in a kind of society which is different than Ted's does. I want to see all of our people, the young people, the old, the poor, the working class, be able to get the education they need, the healthcare they need, the job training they need. Does it cost money to do that? It does. But I believe at the end of the day, that is the kind of nation that the American people would like to see us become. You heard his remarks about you're with the Peterson Institute, which is a conservative group. So I'm talking to somebody who's a conservative. All right. How bad is and I don't know the answer, you tell me, is the Danish healthcare system also terrible?
No, I mean, I think the general characterization of sort of waiting lists across the board is vastly incorrect. And I'll give you the example of my mother, who was hospitalized with cancer. She was treated, in a matter of 1 or 2 days. And this is true on a number of issues. So the demonization of healthcare systems in Europe is just not true.
So that clip demonstrates just one of the many instances where Bernie Sanders took an argument that was used to demonize him and he turned it around and used that to bolster his own argument. So clearly, I think that when I listen to these two debate, there's really no competition. Bernie Sanders, he's the most popular politician in the country because the message that he is articulating, it's easy to digest. He's explaining it in the most sensible way ever. He's telling us that we don't have to be a country that lets people die if they get sick. We don't have to be a country that continues to give tax cuts to the wealthiest Americans while poor people are starving. We don't have to be like that. We can be like other countries. We can learn from other countries. And we can not just have a better healthcare system, but one of the best in the world if we actually try and if we get money out of politics. So Bernie Sanders, I mean, this was a commanding performance from him. I think everything about it it made Ted Cruz look really bad. And I hope that there is future debates, because all of this is helping Bernie Sanders in 2020. It's adding to the case. It's increasing his name recognition. He's able to get his message out there, which is really important, because when he talks about Medicare for all, and there's always this discussion about raising taxes as a result of Medicare for all, he's getting more opportunities through these debates to explain, yeah, even if your taxes go up, you're going to have more money in your pocket because you will no longer have to pay your monthly healthcare premiums. And that's an incredibly important argument to make. So I would say that Bernie Sanders' performance here was near perfect. And the only thing I would add to improve Bernie Sanders' performance was I would suggest to him to bring up the porn tweet, just because Ted Cruz is going Ted Cruz is going to be so embarrassed from that, he's going to try to hide his face. I think that would be the only thing I would improve. But Bernie killed it. This was an ass whooping, unlike anything we've seen from Bernie Sanders before. And it wasn't even that he was aggressive. He just came prepared with the facts. And so if Bernie Sanders is able to pummel Ted Cruz in a debate like this, then I have no doubt in my mind that he would utterly destroy Donald Trump in a debate, someone who is less articulate than Ted Cruz and exponentially more idiotic than Ted Cruz. Bernie Sanders, not only would have won, that sentence didn't sound right, but he would have won in 2016, but if he does run in 2020, it's going to be an ass whooping like we've never seen against Donald Trump, and I think that this just shows it right there. So kudos to Bernie.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.